Now, here is Ticky Fullerton on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton, every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet. We're going all over the world today. But we'll start with a rare find. Sovereign risk attached. Wesfarmers makes a $1.5 billion bid for rare earths miner Lynas Corporation. I unpack the issues with Your Money's chief business reporter, Leo Shanahan. Our exclusive TV interview with AMP Chair and Chair of the former Financial Assistance Inquiry, David Murray. What does he make of the market after the Royal Commission? And what if AMP gets a takeover offer of its own? And we catch up with the British Chamber of Commerce's CEO, David McCredie, as Theresa May loses control of her government in Britain, and with the Washington-based US Study Centre's Bruce Wolpe on why Donald Trump is claiming victory from the Mueller report. Well, that's all of that. Well, over and over again, over the years, I have, Leo Shanahan has, and many journalists have asked the CEO of Wesfarmers about possible takeover targets. Sometimes it was Richard Goyder, and more recently it's been Rob Scott. Well, interest in different sectors, perhaps here or even overseas, although the last big investment, Bunnings UK, was enough to put the great Western Australian conglomerate off the offshore dive for a while. And we got a very clipped response, nothing to see here. But today, a $1.5 billion offer lobbed in for Lynas Corporation. Now, this is very interesting on a couple of levels. Lynas is a rare earths miner and producer. That's basically the big play outside of the China market. It has a terrific mine at Mount Weld, coincidentally also in the West, with its Aussie HQ in Perth. So if you're looking to the future, car batteries, sustainable technologies, rare earths is a great bet. So that's the market upside. The downside everyone's talking about today is the sovereign risk. Why? Well, because Lynas's major production plant is in Malaysia, and in recent months the business has been, shall we say, shirt-fronted by the Malaysian government, or the bureaucracy underneath it, which has been playing to domestic politics and making life very tricky for management. Running Lynas is a lady we've been following very closely and who I have personally a huge regard for, Amanda Lacaze, who's based up in Malaysia and who's been treading a very careful line with the government. Here she is back in November.
He and others in this government are approaching things with an open mind. They listen and they consider sensibly. And as I said, the review committee, as it ended up, is a well-informed and capable committee to make a proper assessment.
Yeah, talking about Mahathir there. Well, in December, while a Malaysian government report gave the green light, a government licensing board then set out new environmental demands for Lynas to get its licence renewed. Now, Amanda Lacaze has jumped through a number of hoops since then, but one sticking point is a new condition that its solid waste, which has a naturally occurring radioactive material, is removed from Malaysia altogether. So here begins a game of chicken, because Lynas employs local Malaysians and has really a pretty good overall record in Malaysia. If it doesn't get the licence renewal, Lynas will have to move out of Malaysia to somewhere else in Asia perhaps, or the vast space of Western Australia to process things, although that might have its own local political risk in this new era of populist green-tinged activism. Well, when Lynas came back after its trading halt today, the shares were up 35%. The board has advised shareholders to sit tight though. What an interesting play. Well, let's continue with Lynas on the potential takeover. Let's bring in Your Money's chief business reporter, Leo Shanahan, who's been looking at this. Leo, what do you think the chances are? Yeah,
very interesting, as you said. Look, I'll have a bet with you. I don't think this is going to go ahead. I don't think, and that's not because Lynas won't jump at it. I think their shareholders would. The management would. Is that term that you used in your introduction, sovereign risk, and I think there's too much of that in this deal for it to proceed. I mean, one would have thought Wesfarmers had a pretty good look at those elements already, and there's smarter people than me working there, working out, you know, the likelihood of this proceeding. But I just don't see...
Well, it's 1.5 out of the 7 that they've got to splash around.
And 1.5 out of the 7. So this isn't the big one. Okay, let's take this back to the question of Wesfarmers, acquisitions. Firstly, I don't think this is the kind of big one that people have been waiting for, obviously, but it is substantial. 1.5. The target is interesting. It frames Wesfarmers, these materials, these rare earths used for computer engines, for developing speakers, all sorts of different new technology, and it's worthwhile stuff. The problem is, from the Lynas perspective, this processing plant. Yeah. And look, I mean, this is from late last year. This is sovereign risk has increased all over the world, and for any business,
this is Amanda saying this.
Of your asset base is more risky than it even was 5 years ago, and that's from Amanda Lakazi, late last year.
So I will take that bet with you, and indeed I'll go against the grain of most market people on the channel today. I think everybody was really surprised. No one really thought of Lynas for a start.
I found it hard to get a read among the analysts on it because no one had really seen it coming, and a lot of those people hadn't married those two up.
So a couple of reasons I think it might be interesting. One is Rob Scott personally has sort of background in fertilisers and so I mean this is sort of his territory. So personally I would have thought he was quite sort of interested, not committed, but interested in it. Secondly, I think there's an enormous amount we don't know about what's going on in the background. Now, Amanda Lakazi is, based in Perth, and the assets in Perth when she's down in Australia. Wesfarmers is in Perth. I mean, I wonder how many of these people actually know each other. There was some thought that there was a joint venture being thought about, and maybe even Lynas was being a bit tricky there, so this is a takeover to push things forward. Who knows what the relationships are? But somebody at Wesfarmers must have a very good read on what the government
they must. And it's obviously a condition precedent of the takeover, ensuring that relevant operating licences in Malaysia are in force and will remain in force for a satisfactory period. So that's got to be beyond this September 19.
Correct. So it's conditional, but somebody must know, even to have made this big public bid, somebody must have a glass half full over there.
Yeah, they must know that licence issue that's going to come into play in September this year, that will be renewed, you would think.
Exactly.
And the idea of just moving it to Western Australia or somewhere else, that's obviously going to be A, extremely costly, and B, you then have to go through this regulatory procedure again. Yes. And this is producing some pretty dirty stuff, quite frankly, some of it which is radioactive.
And it'll knock the equity value of the market cap of Lynas. A lot of it has to come back to Western Australia. But when I asked Amanda Lakazi about this last year, she said it wouldn't kill the company. So if they have to do it, they would do it. The other thing that's been talked about around the place, because it's the share price now, the offer is still not where, the offer is way above where the share price is now, even though it's gone up 35%.
Yeah, went up 35%, as you said, closed at 210, so you're still 25 cents above.
But the idea that other players might be flushed out in this, given that really, if China took over this business, they would basically corner the market.
Well, a bondholder in this company is Japanese Rare Earth Minerals. Now, they have about 200 million in debt on the company. Now, I'd be very interested in their view on all of this.
And my understanding is they're a client.
Others were knocking on the door. Some of the bondholders were knocking on the door not too long ago when they were in trouble. Right. So it'd be interesting to see the Japanese view on this and whether they decide to have a go.
Exactly. And Japan. Sorry, what I meant by that was Japan is a client in terms of rare earths. Yeah. No one's mentioning Glencore. People who are very good at cornering markets, and I'm sort of sitting there thinking, well, here's Wesfarmers. It's a Western Australian company. They've got a CEO who's interested in that sort of chemical stuff. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they go the extra mile to try and lock this away. Anyway, we'll see what happens here.
Let's see.
A beer.
But I mean, you're dealing with a conservative. You're dealing with a conservative company historically with a conservative investor base, and I don't see them necessarily taking that risk.
All right, okay, I'll take you on. Thank you, Leo, very much. Okay, moving to banking now, and AMP Chairman David Murray was on his feet today, warning that any progress post the Hayne Royal Commission should not come at the cost of the bank's independence, and that the talk on culture has actually gone too far. He worries about the bail legislation and what the increasing threat of new or bigger bank levies might in fact mean. Speaking at today's AFR Banking and Wealth Summit, Mr Murray said he sees risks ahead for the availability for credit and that borrowers and small businesses may suffer if the government over-regulates the banking sector. I sat down with David Murray on the sidelines after his speech. David Murray, great to talk to you. In your speech today, you warned about the risk of heading back to the pre-Campbell days in banking. What did you mean?
What I mean is that we are starting to regulate everything again, and the regulation before Campbell had massive cross-subsidies in it which generally hurt low-income people and favoured high-income people. There were huge distortions in the financial system caused by high taxation, and there was misallocation of resources in the economy caused by the regulation of the financial system that actually damaged the quality of economic growth. So because the financial system is an intermediary system, we have to be very careful about its regulation. But increasingly we are regulating everything. We're putting imposts on banks that have the same characteristics as the old, what we call the SRD, LGS ratios in the banks pre-Campbell. And we are limiting banks in their ability to use their judgment to provide credit to the economy.
Well, this goes to responsible lending and credit drying up, and indeed David Littleproud, the Agriculture Minister I spoke to last week, he is against his government's policy now, which is to get banks to lend to flood-stricken farmers up north, but then force them not to foreclose for 3 years.
You know, I understand the sentiment about farmers and about those problems in Queensland. But if you close down the normal credit contract in any way, you close down lending. So you can't have it both ways. If the government wants to resolve a particular problem in the farm sector, then it's better to be transparent and subsidise it from government than to try and do things through the financial system and through the banking system. Increasingly, governments are trying to do that because ever since the global financial crisis, we really suffered from populist politics in most of the OECD.
Well, I think comments today about banks being used as the cookie jar and indeed being misused for the more general public good. Where do you see BEAR and the bank levy now going?
Well, we don't know. We never had a BEAR before. And I don't really see why, how valuable a tool it is, what the cost versus the benefit of a BEAR.
Well, executive accountability, we're told. Well,
that's the role of the boards, and that's what they should pursue if they're any good at their job. It shouldn't take a regulator to do that.
Do you think the Hayne Royal Commission, though, demonstrated that boards had dropped the ball here?
Probably so. And the APRA work on culture and accountability demonstrated some of that. But surely a director with a fiduciary responsibility has to turn that around and deal with it. It shouldn't need legislation.
And you say focus on culture is really over the top now.
Yes, because it's being used as a side story for everything. The notion that if I fix culture, I'll solve things. Culture is a derivative of the systems and leadership model of the organisation. You have to solve the systems and the leadership, and the culture will sort itself out.
You also made interesting comments around sovereign risk and the national credit this morning. How do you think the banks, who've been bashed around quite a lot and they are now shrinking, hopefully to greatness, will impact that?
What we want the banks to do is to keep credit formation open, and to do that they need to be well run, and they have to be able to form judgments themselves, as prudent bankers always have. If we start to close down their capacity by diverting their attention off to millions of pages of black letter law, the fear of reprisals from regulators, and most importantly the responsible lending laws, then they will not do that. So if we're to keep credit functioning during a downturn in the economy, And we've had 27 years on the trot, so we have to think about it. It's our job to think about it.
Now, you also talked about the potential systemic risk of superannuation.
The issue here is that in the Financial System Inquiry in 2014, we did not want to have the same risk that the banking system necessarily runs, being a highly leveraged sector of the financial system. We didn't want to have leverage risk in the banking system and also have leverage risk in the superannuation system, because they cross-infect one another in a crisis.
But the non-listed, I mean, superannuation industry super, for example, which has an enormous amount now of funds under management.
All superannuation funds, if they start acquiring significant assets which are illiquid and unlisted, and we don't have disclosure about that, the members suffer because they can't learn what's in their fund and whether it suits their personal circumstances or not. And the economy can suffer if there's forced selling of these assets in a downturn, because the banks hold the same class of assets as security over their loans, and we get a spiralling down of prices.
You made the point today that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund does have that sort of transparency. Have you spoken to anybody in government, got any response, or indeed in the private sector?
Well, it gets discussed by, I guess, experts in investment strategy and asset allocation when they talk about the difference between some super funds and some others. If you're a superannuation fund that has some defined benefit left in it, your requirement for liquidity is higher than another superannuation fund, maybe with strong default inflows, then you will have a more conservative investment policy and what looks like a lower return. But it is the correct investment strategy. If you're in an industry where you retire earlier, you will want a different investment strategy to other people who might retire later.
David, there's so much money here to invest in Australia, but a lot of pressure on big super to invest a lot of it overseas. Equally, we've got foreign banks now coming in, like HSBC and ING being very successful. Now, if there was another financial crisis in a downturn, what is the risk of a lot of that foreign money disappearing, and we don't have enough domestic investment here?
They're still the same risks. They've been somewhat ameliorated by the turnaround in the current account. It's still in deficit, but probably only a seventh of the deficit that it was at the time of the financial crisis. That's a good thing, but the banks are still dependent on wholesale borrowing offshore. It's always been a curiosity that the superannuation system, given its size, did not invest more in debt in Australia, which is another sign that that system is going for longer, riskier, higher returning assets. But without the transparency, how do we know if that's the right stance or not?
You stuck around to listen to the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. Now, within 50 days, he may well be the Treasurer. What did you think of his speech?
It's difficult for a Treasurer or an incoming Treasurer to really talk about certain types of things. It's not the role of the Treasurer to talk down the economy. It's not the role of the Treasurer to create a lack of confidence in the banking system. So I always understand when Treasurers talk about other things.
But he did talk about a lot of things, a lot of good things that banks could be doing, rather than the system of banking.
I think I used to get in trouble for sort of pushing back on the notion of corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, because I always argued that the greatest thing a banker can do for the whole of society is to run a good bank. The issue is not necessarily about corporate social responsibility, it's about the role that the banks play, and by doing that well you actually help to reduce systemic crisis.
He talked about pushing ahead with an increase to compulsory super. Now, do you think that will be good for the Australian economy, good for the people?
We have to bear in mind that in an accumulation system, the rate of contribution is the end product of a wage bargain. So if it's important to put that up, then that's a matter which should be considered in the normal bargaining between the Fair Work Commission and employers, which is generally surrounded by an economic context.
And we've got pressure on wages growth now.
Yeah, but at the point at which there's a decent trade-off between wage demands and productivity in the economy, that's a wages bargain. Otherwise, if you put up the superannuation contribution just for the sake of putting it up, yes, you've raised wages in the economy. That may or may not be a good thing.
David, interesting, I think, in this post-Hayne environment where vertical integration is here to stay. Now, really, Westpac is the only bank that's gone ahead and is selling its personal financial advisory business. Other banks, McCredie, for example, at the CBA, is holding off on his demerger to focus on remediation. Now, do you think that when these banks look at it again, they might actually decide to keep some of these assets after all, and should they?
I think the Westpac decision, to me, displayed sort of strategic confidence and certainty in what they did want to do and did not. But it also demonstrated to us that there is a cost of unwinding these things, and I think that explains the hesitancy in the other banks.
Now, obviously, when it comes to AMP, financial advice will remain a cornerstone of the business. Do you agree, though, with Kenneth Hayne's recommendation that financial advisors should declare to clients whether they are independent or not?
Most definitely, because in my inquiry we looked at this issue of information asymmetry, knowledge gap between client and advisor, and realised that things had to be done, which we recommended. But so that is a good principle. The issue, though, is whether for most Australians for whom we prescribe in legislation the requirement to get advice, we can't then have a financial system in which advice is unaffordable. That's the trade-off. And at AMP, we want to get in and be great advisors because people need it. But we want it to be affordable. So we'll be looking very closely at the nature of the legislative changes and whether they truly track the path that Hayne wanted to go down, or whether there's further interference in those by the time they get to the Parliament.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they're made too complex and too expensive for it to be done.
Finally, David, a lot going on at AMP. You've made some tough changes around bonuses and the reward system. You're poaching even from the future fund, I see. You've obviously got this issue of funds flow, and you've got legal issues to come. Now, companies like Charter Hall are circling. Are you going to be able to stay on your own?
Well, the fiduciary obligations of the board are the same for every company. We act in the best interest of our owners, and we will do that in all circumstances. But it's pretty clear that the size of the turnaround in AMP is substantial. That's why we're going to the AGM shortly to put down our credentials as a substantially new board. We have one of the characteristics with that change, which I think is fundamental to governance, and that is that to be a director of a company, you have to have operated yourself at least of the level of complexity of work as the CEO that you're supervising is expected to work at. So that's my main criterion. That's why we've made the changes on the board that we have. But there's a long way to go at AMP, and we've got an exciting new Chief Executive Officer to help us through that. And if the size of the challenge is that large, there will be other changes in the team.
David Murray, so good to talk to you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
I wonder how many directors that would throw off boards if we used David Murray's criteria across the top 200. After the break, expectations for super in the upcoming federal budget. Industry Super Australia's chief economist, Stephen Anthony, next.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Wafer thin surplus, just say no to a spendathon. That's the headline from Industry Super Australia's federal budget preview, hot off the press and with just a week to go before budget day. Well, to take us through it, I'm joined by ISA's chief economist, Stephen Anthony. Stephen, nice to see you there. Look, you are, I'm really interested in your paper that you've written. You're reasonably, I suppose, sober about the outlook for the economy, aren't you?
Well, that's right, Ticky. I mean, so for some time, you know, we've been plotting a path forward that was more pessimistic than others, and unfortunately, that vision of the real economy and productivity growth has been borne out. So really, the only thing that's maintained our sort of level of activity has been those very strong terms of trade from China, and that's a temporary factor. And without that, we are an economy that has productivity growth far below its long-term trend, and therefore per capita living standards are not rising.
Right, OK. So what we're basically saying also is that good number on the nominal GDP front, and we're going to actually have a surplus, aren't we? So from an election point of view, this is good for the government, one would think, short term.
Well, the government is to be commended for delivering a surplus. That's the first thing. They shouldn't be criticised for that. And they have exercised, you know, discipline, you know, in the budget to achieve that outcome. But the point is that same discipline must be held, provided that their judgment is that the economy doesn't require further stimulus.
But it's interesting because on the one hand you're saying, yeah, no, we've got this sober outlook. On the other hand, you're saying maybe sort of get the cannon out there for the stimulus, but don't actually shoot anything out there. Don't have a huge splash because we don't need that sort of stimulus right now. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be an economist if I wasn't talking with both my hands, Ticky. But you know, so the point being that it does look like there are storm clouds coming. So let's line up all our approvals. Let's figure out what we think no regrets policy looks like, and let's have it ready to go. But right now, I'm looking at an unemployment rate that's what is it? You know, 4.9. So, you know. We understand this is a very unusual set of circumstances. Productivity less growth equals low wages, which has people substituting towards labour, you know, and not investing in fixed capital. And unfortunately, that's where we are, and that's why the productivity growth rate is so low. Yes. So we're sort of seeing an artificial strength in the economy that won't last. So government must, roll out the fiscal cannon.
Right, so you're calling for increased productivity, you're calling for economic reform. What sort of reforms are you thinking about?
Well, you know, for example, Ross Garnaut's very far-sighted cash flow tax reform to replace the company tax, which essentially would spur business investment in Australia and force multinational companies to pay tax in Australia, which would be a good thing.
Yeah. Well, of course, the BCA would just want the company tax to come down. They tried that sort of reform, but that was knocked back.
Well, by far and away, the majority of Australian domiciled businesses would pay less tax under that proposal. So the BCA would get its wish. It's just that those that aren't paying tax at the moment would bear some burden. But look, in addition, really significantly better prioritised infrastructure spending at key projects. You know, for example, second airport for Melbourne, you know, second seaport for Melbourne, to name two.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've just seen in Sydney the Berejiklian government, it has to be said, come back in, and she ran on her record of spending on infrastructure, and we've got a second airport up here which we're investing in. I mean, can we not give her some credit too?
Oh, we absolutely should give them some credit. You know, the asset recycling policies of the New South Wales government, you know, are really a lesson not only to Australia but to the world. I know the United States have looked very hard at it. So the point being, you know, they've socialised those assets into the hands often of super funds and then used the proceeds to keep investing. And that seems like a very virtuous circle to me.
Okay. I do want to ask you about, I mean, given, as you say, we've got this sober outlook, how does Bill Shorten's idea of a living wage play into this now when we're calling for more productivity and, make sure we sort of delay the cash splash a little to a rainy day? What's a living wage going to do to the numbers?
Well, I think it harks back to the Harvester judgment. What was it, 1908? Look, I completely agree with what Bill Shorten is trying to do here. He's trying to, target those that bear the burden of fiscal adjustment to those who will have the biggest gains in the upswing of an economy, and he's trying to leave those that won't, in a better position than they have been over the previous decade, where essentially their interests have been ignored. So, that's a very noble aspiration. I think provided there's a link to productivity.
Will there be, though? I mean, I don't think there is one thought about, is there?
You know, the interesting thing about grand economic bargains is that where you pick up on the one hand and hopefully create a bigger economy, there is plenty of benefit to be spread around. So I think that's where he's going with this.
Right. Finally, looking out to the end of the term, of the budget estimates, quite interestingly, you actually see in 2022-23, chickens come home to roost, things not looking so good at all.
No, absolutely not. I mean, and I did even start trying, Ticky, in terms of looking at some of the medium-term fiscal pressures on the budget. NDIS, submarine program, population ageing, etc., etc. So, you could imagine a situation where a softening terms of trade, they're currently 50% above the long-term average, and a slower economy, lower productivity growth, combined with all sorts of difficulties offshore, to put us in a budgetary situation that, we've never seen before, which is deficits, 4 or 5 or 6% of GDP.
Sounds like we are behind on the reform side of these numbers are going to come to fruition. But Stephen Anthony, thank you very much for joining us. Really interesting. Thanks.
Thanks for the opportunity, Ticky.
After the break, Democrats demand to see the Mueller report. We'll get across what this means for Trump's future with Bruce Wolpe from the United States Study Centre.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Yes, welcome back. Well, US Congress and President Donald Trump are reacting to Special Counsel Robert Mueller's probe into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Seems a long time ago now. Attorney General Barr says the Special Counsel found no evidence of collusion and doesn't believe Mr. Trump obstructed justice.
We can never, ever let this happen to another president again.
President Trump at the White House reacting to the special counsel's final report, saying Robert Mueller acted honorably.
It's 100% the way it should have been. I wish it could have gone a lot sooner, a lot quicker.
What happens next is up to the Democratic-controlled House and Republican-controlled Senate. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler wants to move forward with his own obstruction of justice investigation after the Attorney General wrote, "The evidence is not sufficient to establish the president committed an offense." Nadler says he'll subpoena the Attorney General to get the full report if necessary.
I would, in fact, wonder if the Attorney General pressured the special counsel into not making that finding so that he could make the finding.
While Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham will investigate the special counsel's origins. That includes potential FISA warrant abuse, allowing surveillance of Trump campaign officials, and the unverified Trump-Russia dossier.
What makes no sense to me is all the abuse by the Department of Justice and the FBI, the unprofessional conduct, the shady behavior. Nobody seems to think that's much important.
Oh, it's fascinating, isn't it? Joining me for his take, really great to have a senior fellow at the United States Studies Centre, Bruce Wolpe. He's here in the studio. He's just back from the United States. Bruce, hello. What a surprise. Well, surprise to us anyway, that Donald Trump seems to have this massive victory.
I think it was a surprise to Trump. I think he was expecting the worst and they were getting ready for it, and it didn't happen. And really on the two major issues that Mueller was looking at, obstruction of justice, collusion with the Russians, Trump was in the clear. It was a big win for him. It was a big setback for Democrats. They were expecting...
That's how you read it?
Yes, because so much was invested in it. If you look at if you take the temperature of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, in the caucus, they want him out of office. They think he's unfit to serve. They think he's not an illegitimate president, but the way... his
Close to it.
Well, with all the chaos in the White House, malfeasance among several cabinet officials and so forth, and just the churn and the attack on allies and what he's doing to the world order. They want him out, and they thought this may be a way to do it or expedite it. That's not going to happen. They want him out. They're going to have to beat him at the ballot box next November.
Well, they can't cope with this bizarre sort of disruption, I suppose, that Trump has imposed on the whole system. But he talks about being totally exonerated.
Well,
is he?
As far as legally, yes. Constitutionally, as the setup piece said, the House Judiciary Committee is going to bore into obstruction of justice. Is there something there? But I think there are limits to that attack and strategy among Democrats. I think the public is kind of exhausted by it. And then if you just look in political terms, his base, look at the result for the base. They love Trump. They're with him. They're more solid than ever.
Will he have to face courts in other courts in the US? And how is that going to play into perhaps the 2020 presidential race?
Mueller spun off a lot of stuff to other jurisdictions, the U.S. Attorney in Washington, but also especially the Southern District of New York. And they are looking at the Trump business interests, the Trump organization, and taxes, insurance, banking records, and so forth. That predates him as president. But just as with Michael Cohen, there could be things that emerge that are very embarrassing to him, and it'll put him on the defensive. But again, it doesn't get to whether he stays in office. But there will be a lot of noise out of New York. There will be a lot of noise on Capitol Hill among the Democrats as they hold hearings into his tax returns, how he's running the government, ties with the Russians. So there's going to be this wall of noise that he'll have to deal with. But again, the mortal threat has been removed.
And really, walls of noise don't seem to impact Donald Trump as they have done other leading figures in America.
The challenge is he came into office, but he hasn't expanded his standing. His base is 35 to 40%. His approval rating is 40, maybe 44%. Disapproval over 50. Every other president goes in and they try and either bring the country together or expand their... He hasn't done that. So the question is there a cost as he goes into 2020? And the great disconnect is the economy is doing so well, but his approval rating...
Through his reforms, one has to say.
But his approval rating stays below 50. So does the end of the Mueller probe, does that change that chemistry? So that, in fact, his approval ratings go higher?
Now, Bruce, we talked about why the Democrats want to get rid of him. A lot of Republicans want to get rid of him, too. What is their position at the moment?
They want to get rid of him less today than they did yesterday.
Well, I guess that's right.
The Republican Party is really... He engaged in a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, and he won. And they are afraid of his power to remove them if they are disloyal to him. He did that in primaries against with senators and congressmen who were not fully in step with him. And so I think they're more tightly tied to Trump than ever before. And the threat of a challenge for his renomination inside the Republican Party, that's not going to happen.
Really?
Or if it does happen, it's now of only marginal potential.
Okay.
So his hold on the Republican Party is solid.
So really, we're looking at the Democrats
versus the Trump and the Republicans.
But versus Trump. Now, impeachment. Any idea of impeachment after Mueller has gone out the window?
Impeachment is dead.
Impeachment is dead. And so the Democrats themselves tell me about what sort of candidate they are going to be selecting and the sort of pressures they are under, because we've got Joe Biden, haven't we now?
Yes, and Beto.
Beto O'Rourke.
You have a field that's larger than the Melbourne Cup, and that hasn't happened before. Several are it's quite a distinguished field. Several are senators. Then there are people. This guy Buttigieg, who's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who may be the new Jimmy Carter, who emerges out of nowhere and is the complete anti-Trump.
Wow.
So they're going to be against each other. The big challenge for the Democrats is going to be not to repeat what happened to the Republicans, where you have a major field that's split 15 ways, and a radical with 15 to 20% of the vote can emerge in a commanding position.
So in all of this, we've got somebody as sort of gorgeous and interesting as AOC, Alexandria Cortez.
Or Beto.
Yeah, but she's too young to be a player. But to what extent is her following going to actually influence who the candidate is, or at least influence that candidate's policies to the left?
That's right. And there's a lot of commentary that the party is going to drift too far to the left and embrace socialism in some respects, and that would be dangerous in capturing the country. The Democrats took back the House last November. They did it by beating moderate Republicans in suburban seats, very similar to what happened with the AOP in Victoria, taking those blue ribbon seats outside of Melbourne. Right. That's where the election's going to be won or lost. You move too far to the left, you can't do that. So it's really going to be a challenge of this incubus of 15 candidates and their great ideas. Will they ultimately understand what it takes to unite? And what ultimately Democrats are looking for, from my time in the States, is they want someone to beat Trump. And if it's the left that can beat Trump, fine. If it's the right that can beat Trump, fine. But they want to find that candidate who can beat Trump. Yeah. So that's, if the primary process among the Democrats is successful in yielding a candidate who, by consensus, can do that, they'll succeed. If not, divided we fall.
So, like, you've been over there while all this has been going on. What is the talk in Washington and New York on the likelihood of another Trump presidency?
Particularly after yesterday, he's seen as more viable than he was going into this. And it is very hard to knock off a president and make them one term. The last time it happened was Jimmy Carter. Every other president, going back to Kennedy, Johnson, Eisenhower, Truman, has been 2 terms. So it is very hard to defeat an incumbent president. They have a vast array of power. They can control the agenda. They can make economic decisions. They can launch airstrikes against a country that serves the national interest, but also shores up their support. In a crisis, the American people want to come together behind their president. And Trump, there are no rules with Trump. And so anything is possible, and he has upended the norms of the American political culture. No one's seen anyone like him before. Yes. And he does it and gets away with it.
He sure does. Bruce Wolpe, what a fantastic insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ticky.
All right, well, after the break, from chaos in America, from the Democrats' point of view anyway, to chaos in Britain as Prime Minister Theresa May loses control of the House. We'll unpack that with the Australian British Chamber of Commerce CEO David McCredie next.
Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Now to Britain. A series of votes will be put forward to the British Parliament in the coming days as to how the country will leave the European Union. They won't be doing it on March the 29th now, will they? 3 junior ministers have resigned over the debacle as the deadline draws near.
The ayes to the right, 329. The noes to the left, 302.
The moment Parliament voted to take back control of Brexit decisively, MPs voted by a majority of 27 to start testing different versions of Brexit in an attempt to break the deadlock. 3 ministers resigning in a show of defiance, Parliament flexing its muscles as Mrs May's power drains away. One of the 3 was Business Minister Richard Harrington, publishing his resignation letter as he voted against his PM. At this critical moment in our country's history, I regret that the government's approach to Brexit is playing roulette with the lives and livelihoods of the vast majority of people in this country. The Commons rebellion confirming what everyone around the PM already knows. She's no longer in the driving seat with no clear pathway through for her Brexit deal and her own cabinet beginning to move against her. Earlier, the PM had returned to the House of Commons to update MPs after agreeing with Brussels last week to delay Brexit, admitting she doesn't have the support to bring back her deal for a 3rd vote, the DUP putting paid to that.
Unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. No Brexit must not happen. And a slow Brexit is not a Brexit that will bring the British people together.
But MPs now reading from their own script. On Wednesday, they will now hold votes to test different Brexit options.
It's time, Mr. Speaker, we put an end to this and move on from the chaos and failure and begin to clean up the mess. It's time for Parliament to work together and agree on a plan B.
Mrs May's made it clear that her government will not be bound by the outcome of Wednesday's votes if they're at odds with her red lines of exiting the single market and customs union. Theresa May and her government are now in full-blown Brexit paralysis. Her only option is to try and pass her deal, even if that means the ultimate sacrifice, an announcement that she will stand down as Prime Minister. Parliament taking control of the Brexit agenda, MPs now expected to vote on various options from no-deal Brexit to revoking Article 50. And what of the Prime Minister? Back in number 10. But for how much longer? Beth Rigby, Sky News.
OK, well, we badly need some analysis on this. Thank goodness David McCredie, CEO of the Australian-British Chamber of Commerce, is back in to help us here. David, what's going to happen this week?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the package probably outlined it as well as you possibly can.
But going forward, I mean, we've got this situation where Parliament has basically taken control, which I find really disturbing, because if they can do that with this, they presumably can do that down the track on any issue.
Well, certainly the precedent issue is one that, I mean, this is unprecedented times, so I guess precedents don't necessarily hold up.
Yes, well, let's hope not. But anyway, in these sort of votes that are going to be thrown up, what do you think will likely happen?
Well, I think the interesting thing is, and we've seen over the last few weeks and over the last couple of months actually now, that Parliament has been very clear on what it won't accept. I guess this is now an opportunity for Parliament to try and tell us what they will accept. I think the challenge...
But is that the way it's going to be, though? The way these votes are being put up, are we not just going to hear more of what they won't accept?
I think we'll certainly hear more of what they won't accept, certainly. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think the problem is, and we've discussed this several times, that there are so many different camps within all parties across the Parliament, between those who are hard Remainers, those who are Norway for now or a Norway-style deal, those who have the Swiss model or the Canada plus model or no deal altogether and just forging out on their own.
But quite a number of those camps are all, you know, I will not eat green eggs and ham, and I won't eat them here or here or here or here, you know, that none of them will compromise. Do we have in this Venn diagram enough of something where they will all agree? I mean, surely the closest thing to that is, ironically, Theresa May's plan.
Well, I think that's right, and that's what William Hague said in the Telegraph this morning. It is basically what Brexiteers in particular will discover is that no deal is not going to get passed, and other deals are probably unlikely to get the numbers as well. So in the end, maybe perhaps backing the Prime Minister's deal, despite all the challenges they see with it, may be the only option.
So no deal is not going to get passed, but if she cannot get anybody, or Parliament can't actually find agreement on anything, then what happens?
Well, we've moved the finishing post last week. So
now, is it to April or to May? I'm not quite sure.
So what happened at the end of last week when the European leaders met and Theresa May had gone to them to ask for an extension, she got a reprieve of sorts. So she was given an extension till the 22nd of May, assuming that her deal, or the deal that the EU have agreed to, is passed by the Parliament, and that extension gives enough time for the Parliament to go through the proper processes to approve that, and for...
So that doesn't go through, and then B is...
The 12th of April.
12th of April. So, but if nothing goes through and nothing is agreed, then we have, 12th of April, a hard Brexit, a no deal, potentially.
Potentially, that's an outcome.
Yes.
There are two other distinct opportunities. One is through the indicative votes in the next couple of days, it could become clear that revoking Article 50 could be an option.
So no Brexit at all?
To not progress with Brexit at all.
Which is what the Prime Minister currently says is absolutely not an option in any way whatsoever.
Well, she's also said that she wasn't prepared to have the votes, the indicative votes. So it depends on whether, now that Parliament are in control rather than the government being in control, These are only indicative votes, so they don't bind the government to follow that agenda.
Yeah. Well, she said that, hasn't she?
And that makes it quite problematic politically in terms of, well, hang on, I'm disregarding votes that the Parliament have given to give me guidance.
But I'm going to agree to revoking Article 50?
Well, I think that's why it's a very unlikely outcome.
So, and the third scenario?
The more likely outcome is that through the indicative votes, it becomes very clear that she's no chance of progressing her meaningful vote 3, which at the moment she's sort of delayed on the basis that she doesn't think she has enough votes just yet.
Yes.
And she doesn't want to go and go and go again on this deal. She wants to try and have one last crack at it, I think is the intent. So for her to manage that, she needs to allow the Parliament to get through the hot air.
Once again, we're going to take it all the way up to April the 20th or whatever it is, yeah?
Well, no, so she needs to go back to the EU to ask for an additional extension. And the EU have made it clear that if there isn't a deal, if the deal that they have agreed isn't passed, the hard Brexit would happen on the 12th of April unless there's a further extension agreed to. And that would only be agreed to if there is a path forward that the EU can see that would make sense for the EU to provide that additional extension for her to get that through the Parliament. And what the EU probably really would like to see is a second referendum. We saw over 1 million people on the streets.
Quickly, you think a second referendum is possibly the most likely scenario?
I don't think it's the most likely scenario. I think they're all equally in the air, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Goodness me, thank goodness you're here. David McCredie, thank you very much. Well, look, that is all for the show tonight. Tomorrow night, former Liberal Party leader John Hewson. Thanks for your company.